Hey everyone, what's happening? I'm Stephen Clinton, and this is the Essential NFL Podcast. We got week 2 of the NFL preseason in the books, and I'm reviewing all the teams across the league in preparation for the season. So, did a different variation of this exercise back in the spring. You can check out all those written reports on teams over at the Essential NFL Substack. But in this version, looking to challenge some of those assumptions and really just update some thoughts to what's going on in the preseason and all that jazz. I'll also talk expected win totals, strength of schedule measures, and fantasy thoughts. And quick programming note on I'll figure out the exact format of the show, but definitely looking to do something either Friday night or Saturday morning, midday. Where I dump my thoughts from watching film over the last week, and obviously spin it forward to the upcoming weekend's games. We'll figure out exactly how I want to do that, but I think that'll be a fun way to catalog my thoughts throughout the year and continue to get a more developed picture of these teams as we get into the games. So, in any case, let's get into today's show. Looking at the NFC East today, and gonna run through it alphabetically, starting with the Dallas Cowboys. So, the Dallas Cowboys. I'm looking at it, and to me, just jotted down the note: Jacksonville Jaguars West, and obviously there's a lot of differences between these two franchises. But the reason I make the comparison is that I think Dallas is going to be heavily dependent on what Dak Prescott's able to do with CeeDee Lamb and George Pickens, and just like I think that Jacksonville is going to be heavily dependent on Trevor Lawrence getting the best out of Brian Thomas Jr. and Travis Hunter. So you can pop back to my AFC South preview episode if you want to hear more on that. I won't belabor the comparison, but it just sticks out to me as two teams where I think that there's question marks on the defense on either side. I think there have to be question marks on the offensive line and associated with the offensive line, the running game. I think in Dallas, you exacerbate the problem with some questions about the group of running backs relative to the group out in Jacksonville. But at the same time, it gets back to what's Dak Prescott going to do with CeeDee Lamb and George Pickens. And I think it's one of those things where the more you think about it in the offseason and you think about it, I think from the perspective of what it should be or could be, it's just so easy to fall in love with this idea, right? And we'll get to the offensive line in just a moment here, but even if it's not significantly improved from last year, or at least last year when Dak was playing, I felt like they got better down the stretch as some of the young guys got into the mix for Dallas and got more seasoned as the year went on. But I think that you just have such a great combination there of inside-outside threat, and CD can line up outside, inside, and he's dominant in the slot, but he can handle himself on the outside. So that gives you a ton of versatility now that you have Pickens, who's at his best one of the better boundary receivers in the league. Really, I think most people would say. I mean, the talent is phenomenal. I think there are some gaps in the game, but that has more to do with what he does and emphasizing his own development. But in terms of just catching the ball on vertical routes and being able to stretch the field and all those things, George Pickens can do all those things. And if we just make the assumption that he's happier in this setting in Dallas where he's playing with Dak Prescott rather than some of the guys he's played with in Pittsburgh, and he's also in an offense that's just going to embrace more of a pass first mentality, I think it's would anticipate seeing. I know Brian Schottenheimer's background might be a little dubious in that regard, but I think with Dak Prescott at quarterback, it's a little bit of a different equation. And so hopefully Pickens is happy, and this is everything it can be, because it makes all the sense in the world on paper if Dak's healthy for him to be able to thrive with these guys. But NFL doesn't always work out the way it looks on paper, as anybody who follows the sport knows. And if it's not going to work out, I think it's certainly the pieces around them on the offense that are going to be kind of the problem. Like rewinding to last year, I'm not sitting here saying I thought that Dak Prescott was playing like transcendent football or anything like that, and everybody was letting him down. But as I watched Dallas struggle through the early part of the season with Dak at quarterback, I also wasn't sitting there thinking, oh, well, I can see how everything else is working, and it's just Dak Prescott consistently messing this offense up, right? Like, I thought Dak was getting the most of what he could out of the group they had out there last year, but they, weren't able to run the ball, weren't very good on the offensive line, and then, of course, didn't have anybody to draw attention away from CeeDee Lamb. And, yeah, as I say that, I remember them, the game where CeeDee Lamb's lining up at running back, and they're deploying him like Deebo Samuel, and it's like, I understand that CeeDee Lamb's a really explosive player, but like at some point, like, you can only ask so much of one player. You can only ask him to have so many touches and take so many hits. And, like, it's not like they were having a problem getting CeeDee Lamb the ball as a receiver. So, asking him to take on even more, hopefully having Pickens there to complement him just, makes the whole operation run smoother. And you get Jake Ferguson as more of an outlet. But, we'll see what happens up front. Obviously, the injury to Tyler Guyton was really disappointing in terms of just, the best case scenario for this offensive line would be for Tyler Guyton to hit the ground running in year 2 and Tyler Booker to do the same in his rookie year over at the guard spot. But, definitely Guyton, showed a lot of need for development last year. I think that off the jump, like the size and the general movement ability are there, but he just struck me as a guy who just was just so raw in the details of the game, and specifically his hand usage and just his ability to get hands on the defensive lineman rather than the other way around was I thought pretty lacking in the film we saw from Guyton last year. And I'm certainly hoping for improvement from him, because it'll be a much more enjoyable offense to watch if he takes the step forward that his pure physical ability suggests he could. But that's a big gap, right? In playing offensive line in the NFL is at the end of the day a lot more about being a technician than just having the raw tools to do it. We've seen great athletes at the position, or at least great athletes in certain areas, flame out in the league. So we'll see what happens. But I think that, there's definitely that scenario where, even with some of the improvements along the O-line, you just don't have enough juice at running back with this combination of Javonte Williams and Miles Sanders, barring something from Jaden Blue. So, I don't know. It's one of those situations where, I see where the passing game can make this an above average offense for sure. But it's just tough for me to envision it being a truly elite unit at this point in Dak Prescott's career, unless they can really support him with more from the offensive line in the run game, in addition to whatever he can provide throwing the ball. I think that with the way the NFL has geared towards trying to limit explosives on defense, and that being the priority, and some of the things that you're seeing, we're obviously in a shifting phase of that. But it's just not conducive to Dak Prescott sitting back and dealing the whole game without really, having anything to spark the offense beyond that. So we'll see. I'm not, super high on it. And then, I think that the other thing that's a little bit concerning is just in terms of talking about the Cowboys as a whole is, I'm not sure that Matt Eberflus is the most inspired selection as a defensive coordinator. I think he's been fine at his different stops, but it's not like he's somebody who I think of as being like over the top creative or doing anything wildly special, right? So I don't know, like, if you're gonna see like a huge boost because you bring Matt Eberflus into the building to run the defense, and they're really just relying so much on this long list of players that is coming off, serious injuries with Demarion Overshown, Trayvon Diggs, and then the rookie Siobhan Ravel Jr. all dealing with knee injuries of some sort or another as they try to get back on the field. And then Deron Bland, who is much healthier at this stage in the process, he's still coming off the foot injury that plagued him last season. I think that he is a safer bet, but at the same time, if they don't get these guys out there, I feel like the back end of this defense is going to be hanging on for dear life throughout the season. We'll see at the linebacker spot. They brought in Jack Sanborn, who played for Eberflus up in Chicago. I think that is a spot where, despite Kenneth Murray having the draft pedigree and maybe some of the more measurable athleticism, it wouldn't surprise me at all if by the time Overshown's ready to get back on the field, if Sanborn hasn't cemented himself as the guy who's going to play next to Overshown, because, Sanborn just, plays with good instincts, plays with good, just a good understanding of the game that's been evident since, he got on the field for Chicago as a rookie, and I could certainly see him, playing well enough to justify staying out there. But at the same time, in the meantime, you're dealing with, you've got one guy who's athletic in Murray, but, really has shown a lack of instincts at all of his stops at this point in the NFL, I would say. And then Sanborn is not the most athletic guy in the world, right? Because, there's a reason that Chicago wanted to upgrade on him, despite those instincts I just mentioned. So, I think that it really is going to come down to whether or not the defensive line can be just dominant. And, as I talk this through, probably some parallels between this defense and the Los Angeles Rams defense, where, it's just the talent's so concentrated in the defensive line, and that group does have the potential to be a pretty high-end unit. Now, in Dallas, you're placing your bets on fewer pieces, and, Osa Odigizua is, really solid, plus interior penetrator. Michael Parsons is, of course, elite, and, they're very unhappy, it sounds like, in addition to that, but I'll leave that whole discussion to the side. And then, you've got the second rounder, Donovan Ezeruka. But, unless you really get, like, a huge amount of juice out of these guys, and I really think that you need more depth than just Parsons and Osa. I think it's just going to be really tough to generate the type of pressure that you want to support this back end, given the talent there. And, you can, drop back and play 7 all you want, but if you're not getting, play 7 in coverage all you want, but if you're not getting pressure with the front 4 consistently, then, you're going to have to change that up. And I don't think that they've necessarily got the horses back there, given all the injuries they're dealing with, to really handle it if they want to start blitzing or anything like that. So we'll see. I think it's a situation where the personnel could still limit them. Flip side of that is, if Maisie Smith continues to progress relative to, improvements he made throughout last season, if he takes another step there, the defensive line could be enough to get this group over the top. But I guess, in summary, on both sides of the ball, I'd say that the Cowboys, feel like you've got, some real star power and real firepower in subsets of both the offensive and defensive units, but then you've got other parts of the unit, with that being O-line, run game, linebacker, secondary, that it's very important that they get to at least average play, so they don't wind up negating the strength of that unit. I think it would be fair to say. So we'll see how it plays out. I think it's a team with a wide range of outcomes. We'll get to projections at the end, but not if you can tell I'm optimistic about some parts of it, but like there's enough things in there that I definitely am uncertain about how it'll all come together. So moving on to another team where it's uncertain where it'll all come together, I got to go with the New York Giants. So, I think that there's 2 key storylines for this offense, right? I think it's the injury situations with Andrew Thomas and Malik Neighbors, who are the blue chip players on this offense who can really elevate them. And then the second storyline would be the eventual passing of the torch from Russell Wilson to Jackson Dart, which I think could be accelerated if you don't get Thomas and Neighbors out there sooner than later. It sounds like Neighbors has returned to the practice field, but if they're not out there to help this team win some games out of the gate, then I don't know how long it makes sense to have Russell Wilson out there. And we'll see how the season progresses, but based on how they have divvied up the reps in the first couple of preseason games, it doesn't seem like the Giants would necessarily feel like sticking Jameis Winston out there is going to be the best use of their snaps if the season goes south here. So, it'll be interesting to see how that happens. Even with those guys, I don't think that this is a particularly talented offense, and I don't think that Russell Wilson is a quarterback who can elevate the guys around him at this stage in his career. I thought that he really limited things in Pittsburgh. They were able to do a couple of things well in that offense last year, but it was not a very broad menu of things that they were able to do, and I think that Russ has really lost his juice as a scrambler, which was such an important part of his game. So great career, and obviously was a ton of fun to watch it while it was rolling in Seattle, but I just don't see how long this is going to last, especially they play an extremely difficult schedule here. So we'll see how that all happens. But when they do make the transition, just watching Jackson Dart in the first couple of preseason games, be interesting to see once he gets out there and starts playing in actual NFL games. I think that just if you're going recent memory, I'd say he's playing much better than this individual in the preseason, but like the natural comparison would be Bo Nix, I think, in terms of, I think that the size is somewhere in the similar bucket, and probably going to have to do similar things as a player in terms of being really accurate with the ball, processing the field well, and then taking full advantage of your athleticism to hopefully add something, extending plays, scrambling for first downs like that to be successful. That was just kind of the initial reaction watching Dart's first couple of games. I thought the first game, ball placement could have been a little bit tighter, a little bit crisper, but I thought that you saw some strides in that regard in the second preseason game. And I just want to take these things with a big grain of salt, because it's a very small sample of throws. You don't know what it's looking like in practice on a day-to-day basis. But it's obviously better to have positive things happen than negative things. So I'm going to be interested to see where he goes from here. It's not a situation where you watch him and feel like he's got just overwhelming tools, and certainly the preseason is not the time to try to figure out really how well these guys are processing out there. If they're struggling, if you're not seeing any examples at all, that's one thing in terms of flagging things, but it's not the most complex things out there right now. So hopefully guys are getting through it. So overall though, I think it would be generally considered positive. And then the thing for the Giants that I want to hit on before transition forward is the one thing that I think is a definitive positive is Abdul Carter. I mean, you just look at the twitch on that guy and the way he's moving, and obviously you get a really strong proof of concept in his preseason tape against Buffalo, because he's going up against Buffalo's first team offensive line, and he's lining up and getting inside O'Cyrus Torrance at the guard spot with relative ease, and and then getting inside Dion Dawkins, and just from the biggest thing I'm trying to get out of preseason when I'm throwing on this film is just get a feel for how these guys look moving around in space, and how they look on contact on an NFL film. And in those regards, Abdul Carter is absolutely ridiculous, just absolutely ridiculous. He is incredibly sudden as an athlete, and then I don't know exactly what he weighs, but like he in terms of like the amount of power and strength and just force he's able to generate out of his frame, like he is, pound for pound, one of the best in the league at that. Like, Jared Verse is another good comparison out of last year's draft class, where like, Verse is not like some 275-pound defensive end, but the amount of, power he's able to generate and the amount of shock he's able to generate on contact are, way up there in terms of best guys in the league. And I think that stuck out to me more than anything really with Carter, is just when he was striking guys, just the suddenness and the snap he's generating. And he's just he's able to set the edge. I think he'll be able to set the edge very, very effectively, despite being a relatively undersized player. It was really cool to see how they were moving him around as well. I think he's going to be a really fun player. You throw out like just the ultimate nightmare. You line him up in one A gap and Dexter Lawrence up in the other A gap, and just have fun with that. Have fun with that. It allows you to line Kayvon Thibodeau and Brian Burns up outside and let them do their thing outside, which I think that was something I had noted as like maybe not the most ideal thing. Is like it seemed like they had more 3 edge rushers than 2 interior and 2 edge, which would obviously be a little bit easier, in terms of, but to me, Abdul Carter, watching that, he'll be able to rush just fine inside. Like he's probably going to be even more dangerous in there, because his quickness over guards and centers is going to be just devastating. I don't think he's going to, I think he'll be a weapon on the inside on passing down. So I don't think that'll, be any sort of a hindrance to the Giants as they scheme this up. They'll be able to line him up wherever they want to. Dexter Lawrence you can do so much with, and then you can mix in Burns and Thibodeau at some different alignments as well. But I think that Abdul Carter is so good that he's going to give them all the flexibility they need in the front there. So I don't think it really affects my season-long outlook for the Giants, because there are other issues in this unit, and like the back end, we'll see how it all comes together. I'm not like I think there's more reason for optimism with some of the additions they've made than maybe like a Dallas or Los Angeles. Like I think that adding like a Javon Holland and a Paulson Adebo, not that Adebo is like a lockdown corner or anything like that, but I think he's certainly above average, and Holland at his best is I think very, very good. yeah, I don't see how I couldn't be more optimistic about that back end than some of these other ones in the league where the talent is just very average, and I think they're going to really rely on having a strong pass rush that allows the coverage to do a lot of things and not put a lot of stress on players. Yeah, I think that, yeah, I'll have to adjust that with the Giants, but, probably, yeah, again, I don't think they've got really the offense to get it rolling, but, the defense, after watching Abdul Carter, I'm just much more optimistic. I understood the draft profile, all those things, but, we see plenty of years where the guys who are drafted top 5 at pass rusher aren't quite what we would hope for out of the gate, I guess you could say, and, yeah, I think this was the opposite of that, where, like, I fully understand the sentiment of people who had him as the number 1 player on their board. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I think that's enough said. But yeah, like, he's one of those guys who he's, if you grade him over, I'm sure, a 5-year period, Abdul Carter would be an elite prospect, at least, just based on the very initial film and just seeing how the dude moves on an NFL field. So very, very excited for Abdul Carter. We'll see how it works out for the Giants as a whole. But man, yeah, I am officially jazzed to watch that pass rush front go. So moving on to the Philadelphia Eagles. I feel like it's been a reasonably quiet camp out of Philly. Landon Dickerson avoids the serious injury, fortunately. Second round pick Andrew Makubo was down early in camp, but he is back and healthy. And my goodness, the beneficiary of some just incomprehensible decision making in that second preseason game on the touchdown. Obviously, Makuba, good job being Johnny on the spot. But man, if he ever sees an opportunity like that in terms of a decision that bad ever again in his NFL career, I will be truly shocked. But yeah, hey, good on him for taking advantage of the opportunity, and it'll be fun to see how he continues to progress and watch him as we get into the regular season and see, some situations you would more expect in NFL play, I guess is what I'll say there. But yeah, I think that, nothing really has changed on the assessment of the Eagles. The team's really deep. I think, Tanner McKee is really impressed for a backup. I think they were able to add a great piece in John Mechie without really, giving up a whole lot. I don't know that Harrison Bryant was necessarily going to beat out Dallas Goedert and Grant Calcaterra and Kylan Granson, who, has shown some things for the Colts, not like a big-time player, but certainly somebody who I think you can get on the field in a tight end rotation. So, nice to have that extra asset. And I think that Mechie fits well with this team's identity, in terms of being a strong run team, all those things. He got to get some receiving production down the stretch last year in Houston, but, I think that he's always going to be more a player that just fits in as, a guy who's going to be able to contribute without necessarily seeing targets, and he's going to be a good player for the team despite that, and that's perfect for Philadelphia, where you've got A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith sucking up the vast majority of the targets. So, I think that, the big question mark, I think, is clearly, the outside cornerback spot across from Quinion Mitchell. I think that, it's important to keep in mind that there's time to figure this out. Like, there's the trade deadline. There's a lot that could happen in these first weeks of the season. And it's also very possible that somebody surprises once we get into the regular season and they get their opportunity out there. And the Eagles, given the number of guys they've paid, certainly would want to keep the door open to that happening, because all the cost-controlled pieces that they can get, that's just going to help them out. I think that the position group that looks like it's not going to skip a beat, even with losing Milton Williams, losing Josh Sweat in free agency. Man, I thought Azeez Ojulari was showing out well, moving fast off the edge in the preseason. I think he fits really well in kind of the way that this scheme is set up in Philadelphia. Going into it, you figured, bringing in Ojulari with Josh Uche and Ogbo Okoronkwo, all guys who have shown ability to do some damage on the edge, bend the edge a little bit, not at a superstar level, but at a level where they can contribute to the pass rush. You figured you would get some sort of a veteran contribution to go along with what they'll get out of Nolan Smith and Jalix Hunt on the edges, and I think Ojulari looks well set up to be that third rusher for them out of the gates. We will see, but I mentioned the name Jalix Hunt. I think that when you look at this room, Jalix Hunt, Moro Jamo. I mean, but both of these guys, it's not that like they were unknowns going into the postseason last year on Philadelphia's Super Bowl run. They had, demonstrated that they were solid rotation players before that. But I thought that both of them really took a step forward in the biggest moments, and that's huge positive when you've got a couple of guys under contract as mid or late round picks for a couple of years here with the number of guys you got to pay. And then just watching through the preseason film, the one guy who stuck out to me and got me looking up the depth chart was Ola Ty Robinson, number 95, stacking up somebody on the edge, and go look up the profile. Nebraska product, 6'5", 285, 290. It wasn't like I saw him be not like I'm raving about him like our guy Abdul Carter, but at the same time it's like, oh man, that's a big strong dude who can set the edge. He's gonna, looks like a guy who's gonna bring some length to that defensive line room, and it's just one more name who gets rolled into the mix. I think he's maybe a 4th round pick this year, and the Eagles just continue to pump out guys along both lines, and their ability to develop at those positions is just so essential, and not just whether it's finding Jordan Mailata and developing him into a great left tackle, and being able to do that, or just continuing to take the more traditional way of developing these mid-round guys into the quality contributors around some of the elite investments that they've made on both the offensive and defensive lines. And it's just a program that's going to produce a lot of wins. I think that this game starts up front, and the Eagles are well equipped to keep doing that. So yeah, they dropped Clint Hurt in as the senior defensive assistant and defensive line coach last year, and did a great job. But obviously their ability to develop predates him, and then over on the offensive side, having Jeff Stoutland in place, just it's a factory. So we'll see how this all shakes out for the Eagles moving forward. But I feel like it's full speed ahead into the season for them. Not a lot of hiccups. So we'll get that matchup between them and Dallas out of the gate on Thursday Night Football, and it should be a good one. It'll be fun. It'll be fun. For I guess for Eagles fans worried about that second cornerback spot, you talk about the team that is well set up to exploit that, and force that that player to be covering an elite receiver. Dallas will give them a taste out of the gate, and then we'll see on the Dallas side. They are going to have their work cut out for them on the respective lines, especially if Micah Parsons isn't going to be out there. So should be a great one to kick off the season though. So jumping forward to the Washington Commanders up next here. I think that so talking about the Washington Commanders, I guess I've got just kind of a big picture gripe with them, and outside of the case where Terry McLaurin is like demanding like a long-term extension at Jamar Chase money, I just really am at a loss to explain how they are in this situation. If you look at Washington in 2020, 2026, and 2027, they have an enormous amount of cap room. They have, I believe, the most projected cap room in the league for 2027. So you're talking about years 3 and 4 on Jaden Daniels' contract. I've talked about this at length. It was kind of the theme of the year when I was doing the reviews in the spring. With the way the NFL salary cap is going up, there's not going to be much at all in the way of quality free agents that you are able to acquire. There's going to be a handful of them, but I would not be surprised to see the numbers dip even lower than this year. And for anybody who doesn't remember this past spring, there just wasn't much at all available in free agency, and most of the players got locked up on deals, and in most cases when guys moved on, their teams had a reason, whether they had a contingency in place with some younger guys that they had developed, or it's just an older veteran who had with multiple injuries. Those were kind of the big cases that we saw. Obviously the numbers are always going to be big in free agency. They got huge this year. But you can go big, but having all the cap space in the world, that only helps you so much when there's only so many players to go around. So I guess all this is to say that, and let me hold on before I get to this conclusion. The second point here is that Washington doesn't have much at all in the way of players that they need to pay. Like, if you're looking at guys that they need to extend, it would be Laramie Tunzel next year, who's got a year left on his deal. Deron Payne would fit under that designation as well. But those are the two guys who would command big money. They've already paid Sam Cosmi, and then the vast majority of the assets on this team that are on their rookie deals are either currently in their second year or are from the most recent draft class. Like this football regime did not inherit much at all in the way of good players on rookie contracts, right? Whether busting on Emmanuel Forbes, we can go through the whole list, but like there just wasn't much of that at all. So you put it all together, and Washington's not going to have players to spend their money on, right? Like they're going to be it's going to be difficult for them to spend all of this. And even if they want to bring Deebo Samuel back next year, even if they want to bring Marshawn Lattimore back next year, and I guess that I look at the situation and they've got cap space this year, and I just don't understand how you can't come to an agreement with Terry McLaurin, either on call it a 1-year raise and a 1-year extension. If he were to walk, he's going to be the best wide receiver in free agency, barring a huge drop off from where we saw him playing just in the playoffs a couple months ago. And so you add in the fact that this guy has been with the team for so long, and he's universally lauded as being this great locker room presence, and had a huge impact on helping Jaden Daniels really maximize his potential during his rookie season as really the only reliable threat that Jaden was throwing to. And I guess I'm, as I say, just at a loss, because I understand, like, if you're up against the cap and you're struggling to get the roster put together, I understand how you can't just give up several $1 million as a gesture of goodwill. But in this situation, like, I don't see why you can't do that. And I'm not this gets back to kind of my philosophy on, I'm fine with spending extra on veteran players during your rookie contract window. Like, you're not giving up any draft picks to go out and acquire Terry McLaurin, right? All you're doing is giving, a little extra money and then signing him to a quality deal into the future when, again, like, who else are you going to get at wide receiver a year from now? I think it's, that's a very dubious, the answers are pretty dubious there. Again, I just don't know why they've allowed this to become such a problem. This is a team that has been more than happy to go out of their way to go acquire, Marshawn Lattimore, who had been dealing with a ton of injuries and is making an enormous contract, an enormous amount of money on his contract. Deebo Samuel coming off a down year, happy to pick up his deal. And, you've got McLaurin, who's, really outperforming his deal and is a much more important player. I mean, he was maybe their best non-quarterback player down the stretch in the playoffs, and Marshawn Lattimore was maybe the worst player on the team. Probably cross out that maybe he was the worst player on the team. It's just, it seems like just kind of a bizarre situation to have gotten yourselves into when, like, there's so much positive going around and there's so much good with this build, and instead we're getting into week 2 of the preseason's done and week 3's rolling, and we've got the offensive coordinator talking about how we really need to get McLaurin out here, and it's just tough when you contrast it with Philadelphia, and you can throw Dallas into this bucket for their situation with Parsons, but like it's just when your main opponent in the division is an organization that has all this stuff buttoned up and everybody's just focused on football during camp and during the season, I don't know. It just strikes me as kind of a weird hill to die on to some extent. So, anyways, long rant about that. I'll move on. But yeah, again, it's more than anything, it's just confusing. At least from the chair I'm sitting in here, and if everything that people say about Terry McLaurin is true, then I would think that you'd be happy to overpay a little bit for him, and pay him. And if you're worried about, and that's the last thing I should add here, is if you're worried about his age drop off, then I would sure as heck think that you could figure out a way to get him enough money in this year and next year that you can make that something, and then have an alternative where it might pay a little less over 3 years, but like you would think that you could find common ground on this because there's not a lack of funds. So and there is going to be a lack of talent to pay in the years to come here. So anyway, that's all on that. Yeah, let's assume that Terry McLaurin does get back in the mix, because this should be a really, really fun offense to watch. I think that much. Yeah, it's maybe, yeah, honestly, like, he and Debo complement each other kind of as well as CD and Pickens do. It's in a very different way, right? But like, there's no clear overlap between, Terry McLaurin is a dominant outside receiver and has been since the day he stepped foot on an NFL field. He's always been a plus player in my book, and he is a great route runner, can do so many things for you. Debo's obviously more of a specialized weapon, brute force and speed. Hopefully he's at full speed, but yeah, you can definitely get both of these guys into the mix very easily. Yeah, I think that Josh Connerly looks great moving around out there. He's got great tools for the position. You'll never know out of the gate at offensive tackle. I don't think, or you never know how it's going to be out of the gate at offensive tackle, and it can be hard to say exactly how the traits are going to translate. But like, just from the early returns, like, I'm really, really excited to see Josh Connerly in game action, and think that there's every possibility that Washington is going to get be potentially all of a sudden one of the top 5-10 tackle tandems in the whole NFL. After last year they were in the bottom 5 teams at that position. And you talk about position groups that are very difficult to acquire talent at, and tackle's probably up there among the scarcest positions. So very impressive, their ability to do that in one off season. And I'm very excited to see what we see of Brandon Coleman kicking inside to guard, which I think will mitigate a lot of the issues he had playing on the edge and in space. I think that his power, all those types of things were positive. So really excited to see what they do with that gate. We'll see what happens at running back here with the whole thing with Brian Robinson potentially being on the move. Don't know what the return would be there, but I mean, if this organization can get even a 5th round pick back, I would not be opposed to that at this point in time, given how much draft capital they've given up, acquiring, Lattimore, acquiring Deebo Samuel, acquiring Tunzel, and, so anyways, I think that, Robinson's not so special that, you can't replicate his production. You've got an extremely run friendly setup with the upgrades on the line. Jaden Daniels' presence at quarterback already made this a really good situation to run in, just because of how much attention he's going to draw and warrant. Thought Jeremy McNichols was good in his opportunities last year. Same for Chris Rodriguez, and then apparently they really liked the 7th rounder with Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt. So talk about a name to trip up your fantasy draft getting into this last week here. But I think that there's a lot of good stuff going on with that Washington offense, and I hope it's a lot of fun to watch. But need to get Terry back on the field. Looking over at the defense, we'll kind of see how all this works out, whether it's some of the veteran names, or whether some of the draft picks they've made can get things going out of the gate for the Commanders. I think that watching back through the playoffs, I think that really the game that sticks out even more than the Eagles game to me is the Lions game. And while they were able to create those plays and swing the tide of the game on the interceptions by Jared Goff, down to down, like, the Lions were just crushing the Commanders. I felt like if they would just run the ball every play the whole game, they wouldn't have lost. It was just not converting their drives into points. And obviously on the other side of the ball, Jaden Daniels was playing spectacular, so it would have been hard to keep pace. I'm not trying to dismiss that out of him, but I mean, it just pointing out that it was a bend don't break approach that is highly volatile that got them by in that playoff run to some degree. And we'll see how the new names stack up, but I think that Trey Amos is going to have to really exceed expectations as a 2nd round pick to really thrive at the outside cornerback position. No, we usually see somebody do that, so it could be Trey Amos, and I think that would go a long way in boosting this group. And then the bigger question, though, I think, if this group is going to be good, I think you just have to get more out of Marshawn Lattimore. I mean, like, if he looks anything like he did last year, I mean, I think you have to cut him. Yeah, he just couldn't move out there, and obviously was dealing with injuries and all that. But like, at the end of the day, you're out on the field. So, yeah, I don't know. I think I'm just popping through those names again, and added some guys up front. I think that Jershawn Newton could definitely develop in his second year. I don't know. You're gonna get something out of Javon Kinlaw's, Eddie Goldman's, but yeah, I don't know how much some of these guys have left in the tank, and whether you're gonna get the boost you need to last year's unit when you swap out Dante Fowler for Von Miller. Probably aren't losing a whole lot there with your edge rush. So I don't know. It seems like in many ways kind of a similar group for Washington, and really, unless you have a second round pick, play beyond expectations at a position where you don't necessarily expect that. Like, yeah, I don't know if it's fair to expect this group to be any better this year than they were last year. So that'll be interesting to see how that plays out with Washington. But that is really, like, I think coming off that playoff run and just watching Jaden Daniels play quarterback, which is just so awesome. I haven't really gotten to talk about him on the show, but I mean, it's just happening so slow for him out there. And, he's just so fast, and he uses his speed so effectively in terms of creating time for himself. And yeah, you could rave about him all day. I think that we're just going to see better and better things as he progresses and, figures out new ways to win in the NFL and just adds to his repertoire, which is already very diverse. So I think that, sky's the limit for Jaden Daniels. He's a phenomenal player, and, really excited to see him back in action. I think that given that you would have had, more expectations for this team, I guess, in terms of like, oh, where will they be next year? And, I think that to get to that level, maybe you have to go a little bit overboard in terms of where you're spending your money and everything like that. But, and in some regards, you feel like they didn't do that, but the big concern is that they did do that to some extent, and if the Marshawn Lattimore trade comes up bust, you're giving up a couple of picks and then paying out a lot of cash to a corner who it just doesn't work out with, rather than maybe having sat quiet and or either trying to deal for Paulson Adebo at the time, since New Orleans was going to let him go, or signing Paulson Adebo in free agency and having that be the addition. So I think that that's a little bit of what plays into it feeling a little muted, is that they did make that addition last year, and but it didn't work out last year. So we'll see how it does this year. But I think that it's just tough to look at this defense and compare it to last year's defense and think that Washington's really going to be like a decisive 12-13 win team. I think that they need to develop better balance on both sides of the ball before they're going to be able to do that. But at the same time, I think there's every possibility this is the best offense in the league. So that would go a long way in terms of offsetting any deficiencies they have on defense. So, moving on to the fantasy notes, I'm high on George Pickens at this point. Maybe that's just something crazy to say during the offseason when he hasn't had the chance to just kind of, remind us all that he'll play when he damn well wants to play, with his body language on the field. But I've got him in a tier that's it's roughly consistent with his ADP, but I was kind of leaning towards Travis Hunter a little bit more as a number 2 option with breakout potential in an offense that should really need to throw the ball. But Pickens has a more proven track record, and with Hunter currently on the shelf and his role a little bit more uncertain, I can certainly see some appeal for Pickens. But yeah, definitely a player that in the range I add him, I'm excited to add George Pickens. There's definitely some downside risk, but if you're taking him in the I guess, fourth round. Sorry, I don't have the rounds written down here, but he's probably around that 4th round turn. I think that you're taking a player who's got all sorts of upside and could end up being, one of the top, 15 receivers. I don't think that's crazy at all. And that's even, accounting for CeeDee Lamb taking the his full workload. I think that you could have both of these players get everything that they can possibly handle and have a situation, have him, lower than a T. Higgins, who has proven that, he's going to do it more consistently in that offense as the number 2. But I think that if you're ranking the number 2s, Pickens is pretty high up there. I had the question of will the Cowboys be the Brian Robinson team? Really doubt that. I could see. I think Javonte Williams had a chance to pile up work in this backfield. You need the volume for him to hit, I think. But if you're in a position where you're draft heavy at other positions, or you take a couple of the younger rookie running backs who might be more third down back specialized roles. Obviously, you wouldn't have taken a Jaden Blue that high, I wouldn't think, but that kind of fits the profile. Throw RJ Harvey out there. If you want to balance your risk a little bit, Javonte Williams, seems well suited to, play on all 3 downs, all those sorts of things. I really love the player Malik Neighbors, but I've been relatively low on him throughout the process. I think that he's unbelievably explosive, and there's tons of positives with his game. But so much of last year's offense was just about getting the ball in his hands. It wasn't like necessarily like a real structured offense that he was operating within. If you were to compare him to Brian Thomas, like I felt like the ways that they were getting Malik Neighbors the ball were a lot more gimmicky than what Brian Thomas was doing in Jacksonville. I felt like he was just kind of dominating in the context of the offense, whereas like for the Giants, and you understand why Malik Neighbors was by far their best player. It was just get him the ball and have him run a 4-yard stop hitch, and hope he can spin outside the guy and get it for 12 and do that 4 times. And obviously there's some downfield routes as well, but like they were just peppering Neighbors at times, and I don't really see like as clearly how that translates to playing in more of a solid offense, I guess I could say. And then I also worry about the quarterback situation. Throw in all his injury stuff, and I just have Neighbors lower than consensus, like not getting him in any drafts really. And again, love the player, and if he were in a different situation, this would be an entirely different discussion. But I don't think it's a great situation, and especially if the defense winds up being really good, and it's they wind up being more of a ball control offense and try to run the ball more, that limits his opportunities as well. So I just don't think that this is going to be a super high flying Giants attack, and I think that Neighbors will be a good fantasy player, but I just don't know that I see him as the guy that I want to be spending my first round pick on, and that's typically what you need to do. Eagles, not a ton to say on the fantasy front. Jalen Hurts up there as a potential QB scoring leader year in, year out, really, with the QB sneak tush push in Philadelphia. Saquon could certainly be the RB1 again. I think A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith, Dallas Goedert, you get fairly reliable guys if they're playing at their ADP. Not as much of a ceiling just because of the way that Philly plays offense and the lack of volume, but still solid picks. Like I think that adding those guys to your team likely to get if you feel relatively confident that you'll get what you want out of those different players. So not much to say on Washington. I think Jaden and Terry McLaurin properly valued. I think Debo is a really interesting dice roll at his draft slot. I think that very wide range of outcomes, but is it crazy to think that Debo could be a top 24 wide receiver with the way Jaden Daniels plays, with the fact that Washington might be giving up a lot of points and needing to score a lot of points and in high scoring games, not in run heavy scripts. I think that there's a very clear high upside case for Deebo Samuel, and the Commanders obviously prioritized going out and getting him, everything like that. I don't know about long-term bets on Deebo given his style of play and everything like that, and I think that there's a very clear floor that we saw. Probably won't see that match last year because he had the pneumonia and everything, but he's had injuries and plays a very physical style, and he's getting older. So I understand the downside case as well, but I think that at the range that Debo is getting drafted, that's probably one where you could get a pretty big hit relative to what you're paying at the price. So be interesting to see. I think that the running back room in Washington is all of a sudden very difficult to navigate. I think Austin Eckler brings value. Especially PPR if you're playing that. that format. What he does as a pass catcher. There's obviously the injury risk there, and then beyond that, I think it's very hard to say how things will sort out. Brian Robinson had actually kind of been the guy that I thought slotted into kind of what I had described Javonte Williams as. Is like if you get don't have like a really reliable running back and you're looking for somebody in that range, like Brian Robinson's probably not going to blow the doors off, but you feel like you're going to get pretty reliable carries week in, week out. He's going to be productive. He's going to be in an offense that should score. But if he's potentially getting traded and you've got 3 different potential names in the mix, I think that this is a backfield where we'll need to wait and see. So, looking at the win totals real quick, real quick, in terms of my comparison metrics, and for those of you who haven't been following the series, I run every team on their season schedule, and then I also run each team in what I call a composite schedule, where you have 62 games, one each against each of the other 31 teams at home and away. And then I put the projected points for and projected points against into a Pythagorean expectation formula that's scaled to 17 games. So even though there's a lot more points for in the 61 format, it gets it scaled down to the same expected win scale. So I compare those two to get my strength of schedule differential. And if you're, if my expected wins for the season is low relative to the composite schedule, it would indicate you have a very difficult schedule, or that you have a difficult schedule, and vice versa. So the bottom 8 teams in the NFL this year in these metrics are in the NFC East and the NFC North. Those two divisions, deep divisions, they both play each other, and then in they're each other's crossover for the NFC, and then their crossover for the AFC. The NFC East is going to get the AFC West, which to me is, outside of the NFC North, probably the deepest division in football with, the changes the Raiders have made. And then obviously the Chargers, the Broncos, and the Chiefs all making the playoffs last year. And then, the NFC North gets the AFC North, another very good division, with, two really strong teams. Obviously, don't need to get too into that until the NFC North show. But so the NFC East, start with Dallas. So I have Dallas at 6.91 expected wins versus they'd be at 7.58 on a neutral schedule. So they've got a minus 0.67 differential to put them at 30th in the league. The Vegas win total there is 7.5, 8.5. I would be inclined to play the under if I'm playing anything there. Again, I see the upside case where Dallas is probably the rare, 7.5, 8.5, where like I could see the offense really clicking and being really strong. And if the defensive line lives up to expectations, even if they don't get it in what they need in the secondary, I could certainly see this team winning 10, 11 games. But it's, a very difficult schedule. So, I would, I think that, higher probability that it winds up going wrong for the Cowboys. But, like, at the same time, I do see the potential for it to go right in a pretty positive way, if that makes sense, relative to typically, teams in this range. It's harder to see them, like, really exceeding that outcome by, like, maybe they're a 9-10 win team, but you can't see them get into that 11-12 range, I think it's a narrow, eyelet they're trying to pierce there, but if everything works out with the pass game with CeeDee Lamb and George Pickens, that could be, such a spectacular unit that could really lift this team. The New York Giants, I have at 4.99 expected wins with a 5.73 comp, so they're minus 0.74 diff, and wind up with the 31st most difficult schedule in the league, despite having a bad season last year. So that's not great luck for the Giants there. So Vegas has them at 5.5 wins. I'm a little bit lower than that. At 5. It's still, as I mentioned, probably need to adjust the defense a little bit more upward after seeing Abdul Carter in action enough to think that that's very, very real. But I still wouldn't be looking to bet the over here. I think that the offense is likely to hold them down, so I would still lean to that under. Philadelphia have them at 11.8 expected wins. They would be at 12.46 on a neutral schedule. That minus 0.66 diff is 29th in the league. So following along. Philadelphia 29th, Dallas 30th, and New York 31st. So Vegas has them at 11.5 wins, a little bit over, so really in the same range. So I don't think there's a ton of value to be gained there. And then Washington have them at 9.77 expected wins. The comparison or composite schedule comparison would be 10.28. That minus 0.51 diff is 25th in the league, and Vegas has them at 9.5. So within a quarter win of Vegas as well. So probably not a ton of value to bet there. In general, as a aside, just not huge on season win totals because I don't feel like there's a huge amount of value to be gained, and your money is going to be tied up for the entire year. So I feel like there's as much of an edge on multiple spreads and totals every week during the season. So it just doesn't make sense to have your money tied up for 4 or 5 months from now, and if you want to get in on the early win totals, then you're talking 8 months, and it just doesn't seem like an effective way to allocate your resources. From my perspective. So, not too big on these, but do like just kind of getting an eye and seeing where I am relative to expectations on different teams as we get into week 1. So anyways, that's it for today's show on the NFC East. I think that I am going to hop into the AFC East next. So going to get that recording up sooner than later. Hope that y'all are enjoying the end of the summer here, and looking forward to some real NFL football sooner than later. If you're enjoying the show, like or subscribe, and look out for more content soon.